Netanyahu, I suspect, will be one of the last to see that he can't carry on this war in the same way. But now we've had this terrible tragedy of the Israelis themselves, by accident, killing three of the hostages. There is much more of a sense in Israel, I think, that the way the operation is being conducted has to change.
What was your reaction to the sight of this article, and does it signify to you a significant shift in tone?
Well, I think it is a very interesting and important letter. And yes, I do think it changes the tone, both from London and from Berlin. The UK and Germany have been Israel's two staunchest supporters in Europe. And so far, I think the British government have been quite hesitant about coming out very clearly, for example, saying too many civilians are being killed. Israel has got to approach this in a different way. The Cameron letter with his German opposite number is very clear in saying, yes, Israel has a right to defend itself, but it can't go on defending itself the way it is. Too many civilians are being killed. They're not thinking enough about how this ends. And so we have to somehow combine the right of Israel to deal with the military threat from Hamas with the Palestinians' need for humanitarian support and thinking about the longer term. That's, I think, what he means by a sustainable ceasefire. If he calls for a ceasefire right now, it would be a waste of time because Hamas would continue to attack Israel. The ceasefire would break down. So there's more to be done to get to that point, I think he's saying, but it's got to be done in a different way.
And how do you think this subtle but significant shift in tone will be received by Netanyahu and by the people around him?
I don't think we should pretend it's going to make all the difference and lead Netanyahu to a change of mind. But it's also very much the tone coming from Washington. I think Anthony Blinken could probably have signed up pretty well word for word to this letter. And having that from three of Israel's staunch supporters in the West must continue to add the pressure on Netanyahu and others in Israel. And Netanyahu, I suspect, will be one of the last to see that he can't carry on this war in the same way. But now we've had this terrible tragedy of the Israelis themselves, by accident, killing three of the hostages. There is much more of a sense in Israel, I think, that the way the operation is being conducted has to change.
And as you say, it's very interesting to see a sort of synergy between what's happening in Washington, this joint article. France has already come out and called for a ceasefire. How much coordination do you think is going on behind the scenes between the sort of top diplomats and foreign ministers right now in terms of the best way to apply pressure on Israel?
I think a lot will be going on behind the scenes. We had the rather awkward spectacle a couple of weeks ago on the UN Security Council resolution of the three Western powers that have the veto, the US, UK, and France, voting three different ways. US vetoing, UK abstaining, France voting in favor. So the Western countries, Europe, America, have not been fully aligned with this, but this does bring the UK and Germany firmly into line with America. The French are a bit further ahead. The French have a very, very difficult domestic problem with a great deal of unease, bursting out into demonstrations, sometimes violence, on these Palestinian rights. And so they are in a slightly different position. But I think the unity is growing behind a call that this war has to be conducted differently, and we have to get to a sustainable ceasefire, as they call it, as soon as possible.
And Lord Ricketts, what do you think would have to happen for America and us here in the United Kingdom to cross that line and to move from the language of sustainable ceasefires to actually saying, enough is enough, this has to stop now?
It's a very good question, and I can't answer it directly, but I think the accumulation of civilian deaths and casualties, the increasing humanitarian catastrophe, the risk of serious outbreaks, for example, of disease, of illness in Gaza, another terrible accident in which hundreds of civilians are killed by some Israeli attack that goes wrong. Any of those things, I think, could be the trigger for the Americans and other allies like the UK to come and say, this has now got to stop. But I think the risk is the one that Lord Cameron highlights in his letter, that forcing a ceasefire before the circumstances allow will not work because Hamas attacks will go on and Israeli responses to them. So agonizing though it is, I think it's not yet that the time is going to be right to say this violence has to stop now. I think it is the time to say, which is what David Cameron is saying, this violence has to, the war has to change. The nature of the war has to change. Israel has to become more targeted, much more conscious about avoiding civilian deaths. And I think that pressure is mounting very fast now.
And in terms of a sustainable ceasefire, I mean, many people will say, well, why can't you just have a ceasefire? But it is difficult because you have to get both sides to sign up to a ceasefire. And I don't quite think Hamas wants to do that either. How important are the neighbouring Arab leaders going to be? And how much do you think David Cameron is speaking to them about the role that they can play, should play? Would they want to have a substantial role in kind of sorting this out?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, a ceasefire can't happen until the two sides are ready to accept it. It also can't happen until you've got some sort of arrangements for who is going to keep the peace, do the humanitarian operation, start the reconstruction after the fighting is over. And there again, I think David Cameron's letter is useful. Many of us, honestly, have been calling for weeks for thinking about how the longer term arrangements are going to work. And yet, I do think that the moderate Arab states, the wealthy Gulf countries, neighbors like Israel and Jordan, they are going to have a key role in the future of Gaza. Clearly, Hamas can't stay in charge. The Palestinian Authority is very weak. It could only take over with a lot of support, financial support, perhaps military, peacekeeping, political support from the moderate Arab countries. Qatar, you remember, played a crucial role in brokering the release of the first set of hostages. Saudi Arabia, others can play a major part, not just in financing a future Palestinian Authority in Gaza, but in helping to make it happen now. And I think David Cameron has been reaching out to those Arab states. He's done some traveling already in the region. They have to be a crucial part of the solution. They may not be very keen on it, but I don't see who else could possibly hold the ring in post-conflict Gaza.
Exactly. I mean, you couldn't really imagine a situation where sort of American boots or British boots were on the ground in Gaza. That just would not feel right, and it just wouldn't feel like it would work. But in terms of whoever does step up to go in and do that peacekeeping, I mean, the goal, of course, is to get rid of Hamas. But when there are so many people, young people, who have seen just, the most horrible, brutal things. They've seen their families slain in front of them. They've seen their entire neighborhood sort of reduced to rubble. It's very difficult, isn't it, for any peacekeeping force to go in and sort of guarantee peace, because there's going to be so much anger and hurt and pain in the aftermath of this. It's not just suddenly going to switch to being a very stable, calm area.
It certainly is not. You're absolutely right. And of course, there's all that raw, brutal anguish. The absolute necessity is to prevent that turning into a generation of Palestinians who are determined to continue this cycle of violence against Israel. First and foremost, I think it needs new Palestinian leaders who can begin to make the case to the people of Gaza that the Hamas approach has not worked. It's brought all the weight of Israeli military attacks down on people's heads. It's smashed Gaza to pieces. That radical opposition, use of terrorism against Israel has not worked. They need to try a different approach, which needs to be living in peace with Israel, having their rights as Palestinian people, having a state, having support from the Arab world, but living in peace, not living in this constant cycle of violence. That's an enormous leadership challenge. In the end, it can only come from the Palestinians. It should be helped by Arab countries and others. But I can't see either Israel continuing to occupy Gaza, that would be catastrophe, or the UN. The Israelis, of course, hate the UN at the moment. So it has to be some sort of coalition of countries. But most of all, the need to get away from the violence has to come from within the Palestinian people. Perhaps this terrible crisis could be an opportunity for everyone to think differently, including in Israel, about how to have peace in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And final question to you, Lord Ricketts. What you've described there is a very calm, clear-eyed route map for a two-state solution. And yet we had the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Sipi Hotovely. She's actually said this on my show. She said it this week. she and others in the leadership don't believe in a two-state solution anymore. I mean, how troubling is that when one side are clearly saying they don't want a two-state solution? I mean, it's fair to say leaders of Hamas probably don't want a two-state solution either. So it's like the rest of the world is commentating, going, yes, we must have a two-state solution, and yet the leaders of the warring factions are saying, no, we don't believe in this anymore. It's a failed ambition.
I mean, you're absolutely right, and it's desperately worrying that that's the case. However, I do not think that is necessarily the view of the majority of people in Israel, or probably of the Palestinians.
Yeah.
You're right, this Israeli government and their ambassador in London believe that. Hamas, the extremists in Gaza, believe it. But I personally believe that the majority of people do want an end of violence. And what is the alternative to a two-state solution? The arrangement of Israel occupying Palestinian lands has been tried for 70 years, and it's produced this. So that really is not a solution for the future. And I just don't see what the alternative that the Israeli government are offering is, except continued occupation and continued violence. So I think this will only come after the Netanyahu government has been changed by the people of Israel, and when a new generation of leaders can be generated in Gaza and the West Bank, who can see beyond the anguish and the anger and the fury to finding a way of living together without this constant recurrence of war.